Section 1. A World on the Brink. December 7th, 1941. A tranquil Sunday morning unfolds over the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The air is warm, the sea a placid mirror reflecting a sky of brilliant, untroubled blue. On the island of Oahu, in the heart of the Hawaiian archipelago, the United States Naval Base is stirring to life with the quiet routines of a peacetime garrison. For the sailors and officers of the Pacific Fleet, it is a day of rest, of letters home, of quiet contemplation before the duties of the week to come. The great battleships, the pride of the nation, sit in serene rows along the shore of the harbor, their gray hulls gleaming in the early morning sun. These vessels are more than just machines of war. They are titans of steel, symbols of American strength and industrial prowess, each one the product of years of meticulous design, painstaking labor, and immense national investment. They are named for states of the Union: Arizona, Oklahoma, California, West Virginia, their very identities interwoven with the fabric of the country they serve. They represent a doctrine of naval power built on the supremacy of the big gun, a belief that decisive battles are won by the thunderous broadsides of heavily armored dreadnoughts. This is a fleet built for a different kind of conflict, a clash of battle lines that has defined naval warfare for centuries. Yet, a new age is dawning, an age whose arrival is not yet fully understood by the world's great naval powers. The aircraft carrier, a vessel once viewed as a mere auxiliary, a scout for the main battle fleet, is beginning to reveal its true potential. These floating airfields, with their complements of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes, can project power over hundreds of miles, striking with a speed and reach that no battleship's guns could ever hope to match. The United States Navy possesses several of these revolutionary ships, but their role in the grand strategy is still a subject of debate. They are precious, powerful assets, but the heart and soul of the fleet, its emotional and strategic center, still resides in the awesome spectacle of Battleship Row. The traditional methods of shipbuilding reflect this preference for the monumental. Constructing a battleship, or even a heavy cruiser, is a slow, deliberate, almost artisanal process. It begins with the laying of a keel, a single steel beam that will form the spine of the vessel. From there, thousands of skilled workers, riveters, welders, electricians, plumbers, will spend years painstakingly assembling the ship, piece by piece. Each frame, each armor plate, each bulkhead is carefully fitted and secured. The complex machinery of the engines, the intricate wiring of the electrical systems, the vast network of pipes, all must be installed with precision. It is a process measured not in months, but in years. A capital ship is a testament to patience and permanence, a floating fortress designed to last for decades. This philosophy of construction has served the nation well in times of peace, allowing for the creation of a powerful and professional navy. But the world of 1941 is no longer at peace. In Europe, a great conflict has been raging for over 2 years, a maelstrom of destruction that has redrawn the map and shattered the old orders. Across the Pacific, the Empire of Japan, driven by its own ambitions and a desperate need for resources, has been engaged in a long and brutal campaign of expansion. Tensions between Washington and Tokyo have been escalating for months, a diplomatic chess game played with oil embargoes, asset freezes, and stern warnings. The atmosphere is thick with unspoken threats and the grim anticipation of a coming storm. Intelligence reports speak of large-scale Japanese naval movements, of fleets massing and disappearing into the vast emptiness of the ocean. But where they are headed, and what their ultimate purpose might be, remains a mystery, a puzzle that preoccupies the minds of strategists and statesmen. The prevailing wisdom is that any Japanese strike would fall upon the Philippines or the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia. The Hawaiian Islands, protected by more than 2,000 miles of open ocean, feel distant, secure, almost invulnerable. This sense of security, this belief in the formidable barrier of the Pacific, has bred a certain complacency. The ships in the harbor are not on high alert. Many are moored side by side, making them easy targets. The airfields are filled with aircraft parked in neat rows, wingtip to wingtip, a measure intended to prevent sabotage, but which leaves them terribly exposed to an attack from the air. The human element, too, is in a state of relaxed readiness. The crews are preparing for their Sunday routines, their thoughts far from the possibility of imminent danger. It is a moment of profound vulnerability, a quiet pause before the world changes forever. Unseen, unheard, and closing fast from the north, a formidable Japanese carrier strike force is preparing to unleash a storm of unprecedented fury. 6 aircraft carriers, the most powerful concentration of naval air power ever assembled, have steamed in secrecy across the ocean. On their flight decks, hundreds of pilots and aircrew make their final preparations, their hearts pounding with a mixture of apprehension and grim resolve. They are the instruments of a meticulously planned operation, a daring gamble designed to cripple the American fleet in a single, devastating blow and secure Japan's dominance over the Pacific. The sun climbs higher in the Hawaiian sky, its warmth spreading across the tranquil waters of the harbor. The hands of the clock tick inexorably forward, moving toward a moment that will be seared into the memory of a nation, a moment that will awaken a sleeping giant and plunge the world into a new and terrible chapter of global conflict. The old era of naval warfare, the age of the mighty battleship, is about to come to a sudden and spectacular end. Section 2. The Echoes of a Silent Harbor. The attack began as a distant drone, a faint humming on the edge of hearing that grew steadily into a deep, menacing roar. For the men on the ships and the bases around the harbor, the first sight of the incoming aircraft was one of confusion rather than alarm. Many assumed it was a drill, an unscheduled but not entirely unusual exercise. But the confusion quickly turned to disbelief, and then to a chilling, heart-stopping realization as the first explosions tore through the quiet morning. The assault was executed with devastating precision. Torpedo bombers, flying low and fast over the water, released their deadly payloads, which streaked through the placid harbor toward the unsuspecting battleships. Dive bombers plunged from the sky, their sirens wailing, their bombs aimed at the decks of the capital ships and the neatly parked aircraft on the nearby fields. The placid scene of a moment before was transformed into a chaotic tableau of fire, smoke, and twisted steel. The great battleships, the symbols of American naval might, absorbed blow after blow. Explosions rocked their massive frames, sending columns of water and debris high into the air. Thick, black smoke billowed from their wounded superstructures, obscuring the sky and casting a pall over the harbor. The sounds were overwhelming. The deafening roar of airplane engines, the sharp crack of anti-aircraft fire, the thunderous detonations of bombs and torpedoes, and the sickening groan of tortured metal. The response, when it came, was fragmented but heroic. Sailors, many of them roused from their sleep, scrambled to their battle stations. They fought back with whatever weapons were available, their courage a stark contrast to the overwhelming nature of the attack. But the element of surprise had been absolute. In less than 2 hours, the core of the United States Pacific Fleet's battle line had been shattered. When the last Japanese aircraft turned and flew back toward their carriers, they left behind a scene of profound devastation. The harbor was a graveyard of ships, many of them resting on the shallow bottom, their upper works still visible above the water, wreathed in smoke. The once proud battleships were crippled, some damaged beyond repair. Hundreds of aircraft had been destroyed on the ground before they ever had a chance to take to the air. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical destruction. The illusion of safety, of an ocean fortress, had been shattered. A wave of shock and anger swept across the United States, uniting a divided nation in a shared sense of purpose and a resolve to respond. However, amidst the wreckage and the sobering reality of the losses, there was a crucial, almost miraculous stroke of fortune. The three aircraft carriers of the Pacific Fleet, the Enterprise, the Lexington, and the Saratoga, were not in the harbor on that fateful morning. They were at sea, engaged in missions to deliver aircraft to distant island outposts. Their absence saved them from the fate of the battleships, and, in doing so, preserved the future of American naval power in the Pacific. In the immediate aftermath, this fact was a small consolation in the face of such a staggering blow. The strategic balance in the Pacific had been violently upended. With the American battle fleet neutralized, the Japanese military embarked on a stunningly successful offensive across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. The Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Malaya, and Singapore fell in rapid succession. The Allied navies, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, suffered a series of defeats. The loss of ships continued to mount. The naval battles in the Java Sea and the Sunda Strait saw Allied cruisers and destroyers overwhelmed by superior Japanese forces. For the United States and its allies, the early months of 1942 were a period of retreat and desperation. The Japanese Navy, with its powerful carrier fleet and its highly skilled pilots, seemed invincible. They controlled a vast maritime empire, and their momentum appeared unstoppable. The numerical superiority they held, particularly in the crucial category of aircraft carriers, felt insurmountable. The remaining American carriers fought bravely, conducting daring raids and slowing the Japanese advance where they could. But they were a small force, facing a seemingly endless tide. The situation was grim, the future uncertain. The nation was now fully engaged in a two-ocean conflict, a global struggle that would demand a mobilization of resources and industrial might on a scale never before seen. The question on everyone's mind was a simple but daunting one. How could the United States possibly recover from such a devastating blow? How could it rebuild its fleet, replace its losses, and challenge an enemy that now held dominion over the seas? The answer would not be found in traditional methods or conventional thinking. It would require a revolution, an industrial miracle that would transform the very nature of shipbuilding and shift the balance of power in the Pacific. The seeds of this revolution were being sown not in the established naval shipyards of the East Coast, but on the sun-drenched shores of California, in the mind of a man who had never built a warship in his life. Section 3. An industrialist's audacious dream. In the dark and uncertain months following the attack on the naval base, as the nation grappled with a string of defeats across the Pacific, a sense of profound urgency gripped the American leadership. The strategic reality was stark and unforgiving. The Japanese fleet was larger, more experienced, and held the initiative. To fight back, to even hold the line, the United States needed ships, more ships, and faster than anyone had ever thought possible. The traditional shipyards, with their methodical, years-long processes, could not meet this unprecedented demand. A battleship, or an aircraft carrier, was a masterpiece of engineering, a complex city of steel that took years to construct. But the nation did not have years. It had months, perhaps even weeks, before the strategic situation could become irreversible. It was a crisis that called for a new way of thinking, for a radical departure from the established norms of industrial production. The moment demanded a visionary, an innovator, who saw not obstacles, but opportunities. A leader who could mobilize labor and materials on a colossal scale and bend the rules of manufacturing to his will. That leader emerged from a background that was as unconventional as his ideas. His name was Henry J. Kaiser. Kaiser was not a shipbuilder by trade. He was a construction magnate, a man who had built his reputation and his fortune on massive civil engineering projects. He had dammed mighty rivers like the Colorado and the Columbia, building the Hoover and Grand Coulee dams. He had paved highways, laid pipelines, and constructed bridges across the American West. His expertise lay in managing enormous, complex projects, in organizing vast armies of workers, and in pioneering new techniques to get the job done faster and more efficiently than anyone else. He was an outsider to the cloistered world of naval architecture and shipbuilding, a world steeped in tradition and governed by rigid, time-honored practices. Where the old guard saw a ship as a single, integrated entity to be built from the keel up, Kaiser saw something different. He saw a collection of components, an assembly of standardized parts that could be manufactured separately and then brought together for final assembly. He envisioned a process more akin to an automobile assembly line than a traditional shipyard. His core idea was prefabrication and modular construction. Instead of building a ship piece by piece on the slipway, his plan was to have huge sections of the hull, double bottoms, bulkheads, deckhouses, built simultaneously in fabrication shops spread across the shipyard. These massive modules, some weighing as much as 200 tons, would then be lifted by giant cranes and welded into place. This approach was revolutionary, and to many in the naval establishment, it was heresy. They questioned whether ships built in such a fashion could be structurally sound. They doubted that the quality and integrity required for a warship could be achieved through such mass production techniques. They looked at Kaiser, the gravel-voiced, hard-charging builder of dams, and saw an amateur, a man who did not understand the intricate art of naval construction. But President Franklin D. Roosevelt, facing the desperate reality of the war, was willing to take a gamble on Kaiser's audacious vision. The need for cargo vessels to supply Britain and the Soviet Union was critical, and Kaiser was given the contracts to build a fleet of simple, unglamorous cargo ships that would come to be known as Liberty ships. He established a network of 7 new shipyards on the West Coast, in places like Richmond, California, and Portland, Oregon. These were not traditional shipyards. They were sprawling industrial complexes, designed from the ground up to facilitate Kaiser's assembly line methods. He recruited a workforce of unprecedented scale and diversity. Tens of thousands of people flocked to the West Coast for the promise of a steady job and a chance to contribute to the war effort. Many of them had never held a welding torch or read a blueprint in their lives. They were farmers, shopkeepers, and, in ever-increasing numbers, women. These Rosie the Riveters of the shipyards would become an iconic symbol of the home front, trading their domestic roles for the demanding, often dangerous work of building the arsenal of democracy. Kaiser's methods proved to be spectacularly successful. The time it took to build a Liberty ship plummeted. What once took over 200 days was reduced to a matter of weeks, and in some famous instances, less than a week. The SS Robert E. Peary was assembled in a record-breaking 4 days and 15.5 hours, a stunning demonstration of what was possible when prefabrication, standardization, and a motivated workforce were combined. These ships were not beautiful, and they were not built to last forever, but they were exactly what the war effort needed: functional, reliable, and, most importantly, available in vast quantities. They formed a lifeline across the Atlantic, a bridge of ships that sustained the Allied war effort. But Kaiser's ambition did not stop with cargo ships. He saw the same principles of mass production being applied to the most complex and vital warships of all: aircraft carriers. While the Liberty ships were proving his methods, the naval war in the Pacific was reaching a critical juncture. The Battle of the Coral Sea and the pivotal Battle of Midway in mid-1942 had halted the Japanese advance, but at a heavy cost. The USS Lexington and the USS Yorktown were lost, leaving the U.S. Navy with a dangerously small number of operational carriers. The need for new carriers was more urgent than ever. Henry J. Kaiser, the dam builder from California, stepped forward and proposed the unthinkable, that his shipyards, already performing miracles with cargo ships, could build the Navy's next generation of fleet carriers, and do it at a speed that would change the course of the war. Section 4. The Symphony of Steel and Human Will. The Kaiser shipyards on the West Coast were not merely places of work. They were vast, sprawling cities of industry, pulsating with a relentless energy, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. From the Richmond yards on the shores of San Francisco Bay to the facilities in Portland, Oregon, and Vancouver, Washington, these were epicenters of a new kind of industrial revolution, one born of wartime necessity. To walk through one of these yards was to be immersed in a symphony of human and mechanical effort. The air was thick with the sharp, metallic scent of welding, the percussive clang of hammers on steel, and the deep groaning of massive cranes, lifting prefabricated sections into the sky. It was a landscape of controlled chaos, a testament to what a nation could achieve when united by a singular purpose. At the heart of this industrial miracle was Henry J. Kaiser's philosophy of mass production, applied to an object far more complex than any automobile: a warship. The secret to his astonishing speed was the systematic deconstruction of the shipbuilding process. A ship was no longer a monolithic entity built from the ground up. Instead, it was an assembly of massive, prefabricated modules. The process began in the vast fabrication shops, enormous buildings where steel plates were cut, shaped, and welded into the constituent parts of a ship's anatomy. Double bottom sections, bulkheads, deck panels, and even sections of the superstructure were built simultaneously. This parallel production was the key. While the keel was being laid on the slipway, dozens of other major components were already taking shape elsewhere in the yard. This broke the traditional linear sequence of shipbuilding, where one step had to be completed before the next could begin. It was a logistical masterpiece, a carefully choreographed dance of steel and labor. The workforce that made this possible was as revolutionary as the methods themselves. Kaiser and his managers recruited from every corner of the country, drawing in people who had never before worked in heavy industry. A significant portion of this new workforce was composed of women who stepped into roles traditionally held by men. They learned to weld, to operate cranes, to read blueprints, and to perform the thousands of demanding tasks required to build a ship. They became known as Rosie the Riveters, or, in this case, Wendy the Welders, and their contribution was indispensable. They proved that patriotism and determination were not limited by gender. To support this massive new workforce, many of whom had relocated from across the country, Kaiser created entire communities. He built housing, hospitals, and childcare centers, understanding that the well-being of his workers was directly linked to their productivity. His on-site healthcare plans were revolutionary for their time, a forerunner of modern health maintenance organizations. He knew that to build ships at an unprecedented rate, he had to take care of the people who were building them. The most dramatic phase of construction was the final assembly on the slipways. Here, towering whirly cranes, capable of lifting immense weights, would pick up the prefabricated modules from the fabrication yards and carefully lower them into place. A double bottom section weighing over 100 tons would be swung into position, followed by massive transverse bulkheads that formed the ship's skeletal structure. Welders would then swarm over the seams, their torches casting a brilliant light as they fused the giant pieces of the puzzle together. This method of assembly dramatically reduced the time a ship spent on the slipway, freeing it up for the next keel to be laid. The scale of the operation was staggering. Raw materials, steel from Pennsylvania, engines from the Midwest, wiring from New England, flowed into the West Coast yards in a continuous stream, transported by a national railway system mobilized for war. It was a logistical network of continental proportions, all feeding the insatiable appetite of the shipyards. The first great test of this system was the Liberty ship program. These simple, mass-produced cargo vessels were the perfect proving ground for Kaiser's methods. The speed of their construction became legendary. A process that traditionally took the better part of a year was compressed into weeks. The record-breaking construction of the SS Robert E. Peary, from keel laying to launch in less than 5 days, was a publicity triumph. But it was also a powerful demonstration of the efficiency of the assembly line process. It showed the world, and more importantly the skeptics in Washington, that the Kaiser system worked. Having proven his methods on these humble but vital cargo ships, Kaiser turned his attention to a far greater challenge: the construction of escort carriers. These smaller, jeep carriers were built on modified cargo ship or oil tanker hulls. While not as large or as powerful as the fleet carriers, they were desperately needed to protect convoys from submarines in the Atlantic and to support amphibious landings in the Pacific. Kaiser's yards began producing these escort carriers, known as the Casablanca-class, at an astonishing rate. In 1 year, from 1943 to 1944, his Vancouver shipyard launched 50 of them, nearly one a week. It was an industrial achievement that defied belief. This success with escort carriers was the final, irrefutable argument. It proved that Kaiser's methods of prefabrication and modular assembly could be adapted to the construction of complex warships. The stage was now set for the ultimate test of his industrial vision: the mass production of the Essex-class fleet carriers, the ships that would form the heart of a new American Navy and carry the fight across the Pacific. The symphony of steel and human will that had echoed through the shipyards was about to deliver its masterpiece. Section 5. The forging of the Essex-class. The Essex-class aircraft carrier was not merely a ship. It was a weapon system of unparalleled complexity and power, a floating city and airfield designed to dominate the vast oceanic battlefields of the Pacific. Its design was the culmination of years of naval aviation experience, incorporating the hard-won lessons from the early carrier battles of the war. With a standard displacement of 27,100 tons and an overall length of over 870 feet, it was a formidable vessel. Its flight deck was a sprawling runway, capable of launching and recovering nearly 100 aircraft, a potent air group that included fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. Below decks, it was a labyrinth of hangars, workshops, ammunition magazines, and living quarters for a crew of over 2,600 men. It was equipped with advanced radar, powerful anti-aircraft batteries, and a sophisticated command and control center. Building one such vessel was a monumental undertaking. Building dozens of them at a speed that would outpace the enemy's ability to wage war was a challenge of an entirely different order of magnitude. It was this challenge that Henry J. Kaiser's shipyards, along with established naval yards like Newport News Shipbuilding and the Bethlehem Steel Company, were tasked to meet. While Kaiser's own yards focused primarily on the mass production of escort carriers, the revolutionary production techniques he had championed were adopted and adapted by the entire shipbuilding industry. The principles of prefabrication and modular construction became the new standard, transforming the way these complex warships were built. The construction of an Essex-class carrier, such as the USS Essex, CV-9 itself, became a showcase of this new industrial doctrine. The process began not with a single keel, but with the simultaneous fabrication of numerous giant sections throughout the shipyard. Deep in the steel mills and fabrication shops, the ship's skeleton took shape in massive, pre-assembled chunks. Double bottoms, engine room compartments, and sections of the armored flight deck were built as self-contained modules, complete with internal framing, piping, and wiring already installed. This was a radical departure from the old way, where electricians and pipe fitters would have to work in the cramped, dark confines of a nearly completed hull. Now, much of that intricate work could be done out in the open, with better lighting, easier access, and greater efficiency. As these enormous modules were completed, they were transported to the building slip, the inclined berth where the ship would be assembled. Towering cranes, the workhorses of the shipyard, would then lift these sections, some weighing hundreds of tons, and carefully lower them into position, where they were welded together to form the growing hull. The ship came together like a giant, three-dimensional puzzle, rising with astonishing speed from the slipway. The application of welding, rather than the more traditional riveting, was another key to this rapid construction. Welding was faster, created a stronger and lighter hull, and was a skill that could be taught relatively quickly to the thousands of new workers, including the many women who joined the shipyard workforce. The sound of the rivet gun was replaced by the bright, hissing arc of the welding torch, a symbol of the new age of shipbuilding. The entire process was a marvel of project management and logistics. A constant flow of materials from across the country had to be precisely timed to arrive at the yard exactly when needed. Thousands of blueprints had to be coordinated, and tens of thousands of workers, spread across 3 shifts, had to be organized into a cohesive and efficient force. The pressure was immense. Every day saved in the construction of a carrier was a day it could be on the front lines, contributing to the war effort. The results of this industrial mobilization were nothing short of breathtaking. The first ship of the class, the USS Essex, was laid down in April of 1941, before the United States had even entered the war. Its construction proceeded along more traditional lines initially, but was accelerated as the new methods were implemented. It was launched in July of 1942 and commissioned into the fleet on the final day of that year. From keel laying to commissioning, the process had taken approximately 20 months. But as the shipyards perfected the new techniques, this timeline shrank dramatically. Later ships in the class, like the USS Hancock and the USS Ticonderoga, were completed in as little as 12 to 15 months. For a warship of such size and complexity, this was a pace of construction that had been previously unimaginable. It was a pace that the Axis powers simply could not match. While Japan struggled to build a handful of new carriers over the course of several years, the United States was laying the keels for new Essex-class carriers every few months. The industrial might of the nation, fully awakened and focused on a single goal, was beginning to generate an unstoppable momentum. The Essex-class carriers were more than just ships. They were symbols of a nation's resolve. Each launch was a celebration, a moment of pride and hope for the workers who had built them and for the country they would serve. As these gray giants slid down the ways and into the water, they represented a tangible promise that the losses of the past would be avenged, and that a new and powerful fleet was being forged, a fleet that would sweep across the Pacific and carry the war to the enemy's doorstep. Section 6. An unstoppable tide of steel. The year 1943 marked a profound and decisive shift in the Pacific War, a change driven not by a single, dramatic battle, but by the relentless, grinding hum of American industry. While the frontline soldiers and sailors fought with courage and tenacity on distant islands and seas, a different kind of army was winning the war on the home front. This was the army of welders, crane operators, engineers, and laborers in the shipyards, and their weapon was an avalanche of steel. The production of the Essex-class carriers, once a remarkable feat, became a routine miracle. The shipyards of the United States, from Quincy, Massachusetts, to Newport News, Virginia, and across the nation, had fully absorbed and mastered the techniques of rapid, modular construction. The result was an outpouring of naval power that was unprecedented in the history of warfare. What had begun with the USS Essex in late 1942 soon became a torrent. In 1943 alone, A staggering number of new fleet carriers were commissioned. The New Yorktown, named in honor of the carrier lost at Midway. The Intrepid. The New Hornet, honoring its namesake lost in the Santa Cruz Islands. The Franklin. The Ticonderoga. The Randolph. The names themselves became a litany of resilience and resolve, a roll call of industrial might. The pace was relentless. On average, a new Essex-class carrier was joining the fleet every 3 to 4 months. This was in addition to the 9 light carriers of the Independence class, which were built on converted cruiser hulls and entered service in 1943, and the ongoing, astonishing production of escort carriers from yards like Kaiser's. By the end of 1943, the numerical disparity in naval aviation that had so favored Japan at the start of the war had been completely erased. By early 1944, it had been reversed into an overwhelming American advantage. This industrial tidal wave had a profound and demoralizing effect on the Japanese naval command. Their own industrial base, limited by a scarcity of raw materials and a smaller manufacturing capacity, could not possibly compete. For Japan, the construction of a new fleet carrier, like the Taiho, was a multi-year national priority. They simply did not have the resources to build ships on the same scale or at the same speed. The strategic calculus of the war was fundamentally altered. For the Japanese, every carrier lost was a catastrophic, almost irreplaceable blow. For the United States, while the loss of any ship was a tragic event, it was a setback that could be overcome. The production lines at home were already working on its replacement. This reality rendered Japan's early victories and its strategy of a decisive, attritional battle almost meaningless. They could win a battle, sink a ship, but they could not sink the shipyards of Richmond, Quincy, and Newport News. The American fleet that was assembling in the Pacific in late 1943 and early 1944 was unlike any naval force the world had ever seen. The centerpiece of this new power was the Fast Carrier Task Force, a mighty armada known by its designations as Task Force 38 or Task Force 58, depending on its command structure. This force was a self-contained mobile juggernaut of destruction. At its core were the new Essex-class carriers, often operating in task groups of 4 or 5, each carrier with its air group of nearly 100 planes. Screening these vital assets were the new, fast battleships, themselves a product of the accelerated wartime construction programs. Surrounding them were flotillas of cruisers and destroyers, providing anti-aircraft and anti-submarine defense. The logistical tale that supported this fleet was a miracle in itself, a floating train of oilers, ammunition ships, and supply vessels that allowed the task force to remain at sea for months at a time, projecting power across thousands of miles of ocean. The sight of this fleet was awe-inspiring. Dozens of warships spread across the horizon, a city of steel moving at 25 knots. From the flight decks of the carriers, a storm of aircraft could be unleashed at a moment's notice. Grumman F-6F, Hellcat fighters to sweep the skies, Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver, dive bombers to strike at ships and ground targets, and Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers to deliver the killing blow. This was the fleet that Henry J. Kaiser's industrial vision had helped to create. It was the physical embodiment of the arsenal of democracy. Each ship was a product of the labor of thousands of Americans, a symbol of a nation's collective will forged in steel. The young men who flew the planes and sailed the ships were the sharp point of the spear, but the spear itself had been forged in the fires of American industry. As this unstoppable tide of steel steamed west across the Pacific, it carried with it the certainty of a changing war. The days of desperate defense and holding actions were over. The lean months of 1942 were a distant memory. A new phase of the conflict was about to begin, an offensive that would be relentless, overwhelming, and powered by the greatest naval force ever assembled. The shipyards had done their work. Now, It was time for the ships to do theirs. Section 7. The Decisive Edge at Sea. June 19, 1944. The waters of the Philippine Sea, west of the Mariana Islands. The American Fast Carrier Task Force, designated as Task Force 58, sliced through the blue Pacific. It was an armada of unprecedented scale and power, a concentration of naval might that would have been unimaginable just 2 years earlier. The force comprised 15 aircraft carriers, 7 fast battleships, 21 cruisers, and dozens of destroyers. The heart of this fleet, its primary striking power, resided in the Essex-class carriers, their flight decks crowded with the latest generation of naval aircraft. Their mission was to support the American invasion of Saipan, a critical step in the island-hopping campaign toward Japan. But on this day, they faced their greatest test. The Japanese combined fleet was steaming out to meet them, determined to force a decisive battle, one that they hoped would annihilate the American carriers and turn the tide of the war back in their favor. The resulting engagement would become known as the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and it would serve as the ultimate validation of America's industrial strategy. The Japanese plan was ambitious. They intended to use the greater range of their aircraft, combined with the assistance of land-based planes from nearby islands, to strike the American fleet from a distance, destroying the carriers before the American planes could even get within range to retaliate. It was a sound plan in theory, but it failed to account for 3 decisive factors that had emerged from the American industrial and training revolution. The first was the sheer numerical superiority of the American force. The 15 carriers of Task Force 58 could put over 900 aircraft into the sky, a number that dwarfed the Japanese carrier air strength. This overwhelming advantage was a direct result of the shipyards that were launching new carriers every few months. The second factor was technology. The new Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighter, which now equipped the American carrier squadrons, was a superb aircraft. It was fast, rugged, well-armed, and, crucially, much easier to fly than its Japanese counterpart, the Mitsubishi A6M0. It could outperform the Zero in almost every respect, especially at high altitude, and its tough construction allowed it to absorb significant damage and still bring its pilot home. The third, and perhaps most important factor, was the quality of the American pilots. While Japan's cadre of highly experienced veteran pilots had been steadily depleted through years of constant combat, the United States had established a massive and highly effective pilot training program. New American pilots arrived in the fleet well-trained, competent, and confident in their machines. As the waves of Japanese aircraft approached the American fleet, they flew into a buzzsaw of defensive power. The first line of defense was the fleet's combat air patrol, a screen of Hellcat fighters vectored out by the ship's radar controllers to intercept the attackers far from the carriers. The superiority of the Hellcat and the skill of the American pilots quickly became apparent. The sky became a swirling chaos of dogfights, but the outcome was brutally one-sided. American pilots, using their advantages in speed, firepower, and teamwork, began to systematically dismantle the Japanese formations. One American pilot, Commander David McCampbell, who would go on to become the Navy's top ace, famously remarked that it was like an old-time turkey shoot. The phrase stuck, and the lopsided aerial battle of that day became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The few Japanese planes that managed to break through the fighter screen then had to face the fleet's anti-aircraft defenses, a blistering wall of fire from the battleships, cruisers, and destroyers that had been perfected through painful experience. The sky was filled with the dark puffs of exploding shells. Very few attackers made it through this gauntlet to even glimpse the American carriers. By the end of the day, the results were staggering. The Japanese had lost hundreds of aircraft, a catastrophic blow that effectively wiped out their carrier air power for the remainder of the war. American losses, by contrast, were remarkably light. The industrial production of aircraft, like that of ships, meant that these losses, while tragic, were easily replaceable. Furthermore, American submarines, operating in concert with the fleet, had a spectacular day, sinking two of Japan's largest aircraft carriers, including their newest, the Taiho. The battle was a resounding victory for the United States, a triumph not just of tactics and courage, but of a superior industrial and logistical system. The Essex-class carriers, which formed the backbone of Task Force 58, had performed flawlessly. They were the platforms from which this overwhelming air power had been projected. They were the products of a system that could not only build ships faster than the enemy, but could also design, produce, and deploy better aircraft and train pilots more effectively. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was the ultimate proof that the war in the Pacific had become a war of production, and it was a war that Japan could no longer hope to win. The unstoppable tide of steel that had flowed from the American shipyards had delivered its decisive edge at sea, breaking the back of the Japanese Navy and opening the door to the final stages of the conflict. Section 8. The Strategy of an Unrelenting Advance. With the Japanese Navy's air arm shattered after the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the path was cleared for the United States to execute its grand strategy for winning the war in the Pacific, a relentless, island-hopping advance toward the Japanese home islands. This strategy, known as leapfrogging, was a brilliant solution to the immense geographical challenges of the Pacific theater. Rather than attempting to capture every single heavily fortified island held by the Japanese, which would have been a costly and time-consuming endeavor, the Allied forces would bypass certain enemy strongholds, leaving them to wither on the vine, cut off from supply and reinforcement. Instead, the focus was on seizing strategically important islands that could serve as forward bases for the next leap. These captured islands would become home to airfields for land-based bombers and staging areas for future amphibious invasions. The linchpin of this entire strategy, the element that made it all possible, was the massive and mobile power of the fast carrier task force. The fleet, with its core of Essex-class carriers, acted as a sovereign, mobile territory. It could move across the vast ocean, project overwhelming air power against a chosen target, support the amphibious landings, and then move on to the next objective. The carriers were the ultimate enablers of the leapfrogging campaign. Before an invasion, the carrier task force would arrive off the target island and begin a systematic process of isolating the battlefield. Their aircraft would pound enemy airfields, destroying planes on the ground and ensuring that the skies were clear of opposition. They would strike defensive positions, supply dumps, and command centers, softening up the target for the impending landing. When the Marines and Army troops hit the beaches, the carrier aircraft would provide close air support, acting as flying artillery to suppress enemy strongpoints and break up counterattacks. This mobile air cover was absolutely essential, as it often took weeks or months to capture an island and build a functional airfield for land-based planes. During that critical period, the carriers provided the only available air support. The logistical effort required to keep this massive fleet operational thousands of miles from its home bases was a feat of organization as impressive as the construction of the ships themselves. An enormous fleet of support vessels, known as the Service Squadron, accompanied the combat fleet. This fleet train consisted of fast oilers, ammunition ships, refrigeration ships carrying fresh food, and even escort carriers bringing replacement aircraft and pilots. The process of replenishment at sea was a carefully choreographed and dangerous ballet. The warships of the task force would rendezvous with the supply ships in a designated patch of open ocean. Lines would be passed between the moving vessels, and thick hoses would be connected to transfer thousands of tons of fuel oil. Pallets of ammunition, food, and mail would be high-lined across the churning water between the ships. It was a continuous, round-the-clock operation that allowed the fast carrier task force to remain in the combat zone for extended periods, maintaining a relentless pressure on the enemy. This ability to stay at sea and keep fighting was another crucial advantage that the Japanese could not match. The advance across the Central Pacific was a testament to the effectiveness of this carrier-centric strategy. After the capture of the Marianas, which provided bases for the new long-range B-29 bombers to begin their air campaign, the fleet supported the invasions of Peleliu and the Palau Islands. Then came the momentous return to the Philippines. The invasion of Leyte in October of 1944 prompted the Japanese Navy to commit its remaining surface forces in a final, desperate gamble, leading to the sprawling Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. In this series of engagements, the American carrier fleet once again played the decisive role. Its aircraft were instrumental in sinking some of the last remnants of the Japanese fleet, including the super battleship Musashi. Although the fleet was tested by new and desperate enemy tactics, its resilience and overwhelming power carried the day. Following the liberation of the Philippines, the island-hopping campaign continued with the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. These were brutal, costly battles, fought against a deeply entrenched and fanatical defender. The carriers and their crews were pushed to their limits, operating for weeks on end in close proximity to enemy air bases. They endured relentless attacks and suffered damage, but the fleet's ability to absorb these blows and continue fighting was unshakable. If a carrier was damaged, it could withdraw for repairs, and another would be ready to take its place, fresh from the shipyards back home. This relentless advance was powered by the industrial engine that Henry J. Kaiser and others had built. The strategy of leapfrogging was predicated on having a naval force so large and so powerful that it could be everywhere at once, striking where it chose and dictating the time and place of battle. It was a strategy made possible by the men and women who, thousands of miles away, had built the ships that made it all happen, launching an unending stream of carriers that became the flagships of victory. Section 9. The inevitable conclusion. By the early months of 1945, the strategic situation in the Pacific had become one of grim inevitability. The industrial might of the United States, symbolized by the vast fleet of over 100 aircraft carriers of all classes now at its disposal, had created a disparity of power that was simply too vast for Japan to overcome. The Japanese Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. Its few remaining carriers were either sunk or confined to port for lack of fuel and trained pilots. Its mighty battleships, including the Yamato, the largest in the world, were sent on final, hopeless missions, where they were overwhelmed by the sheer number of American carrier aircraft. The fast carrier task force roamed the seas off the coast of Japan with near impunity. The Essex-class carriers that formed the core of this fleet launched strike after strike against the Japanese home islands. Their aircraft targeted naval bases, industrial facilities, and transportation networks, tightening the blockade and systematically dismantling the enemy's ability to wage war. The sky over Japan, once protected by the elite pilots of the Imperial Navy, now belonged to the Hellcats, Corsairs, and Helldivers of the U.S. Navy. The contrast between the two nations' industrial capacities was now starkly and tragically visible. While American shipyards continued to produce new ships and repair damaged ones with remarkable efficiency, Japanese industry was crippled. The constant air attacks and the effective submarine blockade had starved the nation of the raw materials, oil, rubber, steel, that were the lifeblood of a modern war machine. The very industrial base that Japan would have needed to rebuild its fleet was itself a primary target of the fleet it could no longer challenge at sea. The story of the carriers had come full circle. The conflict that had begun with a devastating carrier-based attack on the American fleet was now ending with an overwhelming American carrier-based assault on the Japanese homeland. The strategic revolution that had been heralded by the events of December 7, 1941, had reached its logical and devastating conclusion. The aircraft carrier had proven itself to be the undisputed queen of the seas, the dominant capital ship of the 20th century. The industrial power that could produce these complex weapons in quantity was the nation that would ultimately achieve victory. This industrial dominance did more than just win battles. It fundamentally shaped the end of the conflict. It provided American leaders with a range of options and a degree of military superiority that was absolute. The blockade and the conventional air campaign from carriers and land bases were systematically strangling Japan, but the prospect of a final invasion of the home islands still loomed, an operation that was projected to result in immense casualties on both sides. It was in this context that the final, terrible chapter of the war unfolded. A weapon of a new and unseen power, the product of a secret and immense scientific and industrial effort, was unleashed upon two cities. This momentous and tragic event, which hastened the end of the conflict, was itself another manifestation of the same industrial and technological superiority that had built the carrier fleet. It was the culmination of a war that had become a total contest between entire national systems. Their scientific knowledge, their engineering prowess, their manufacturing capacity, and the will of their people. The men and women in the Kaiser shipyards and in factories across the United States had not just been building ships or planes. They had been building the foundations of victory. Their labor, often unglamorous and always demanding, had forged the tools that made the final outcome possible. When the official surrender was signed on the deck of the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, the waters of the bay were filled with the ships of the Allied fleet. Dominating the scene were the long, flat-top silhouettes of the American aircraft carriers, including many of the Essex-class veterans that had fought their way across the Pacific. They were a quiet but powerful testament to the journey that had begun in the smoke and fire of a harbor 4 years earlier. They represented the incredible story of a nation that had transformed a devastating defeat into an overwhelming strategic advantage, a story of resilience, innovation, and a productive power that the world had never before witnessed. The war was over, but the legacy of the industrial miracle that had helped to win it would endure. Section 10. A legacy forged in steel and unity. The end of the Second World War left a world transformed, a geopolitical landscape reshaped by years of unprecedented conflict. In the quiet aftermath, as nations began the arduous task of rebuilding, the true scale of the American industrial achievement could be fully appreciated. The story of Henry J. Kaiser's shipyards and the mass production of aircraft carriers was more than just a chapter in military history. It was a profound lesson in the power of human ingenuity, collective effort, and national will. It demonstrated that in the modern era, the factory floor could be as decisive as the battlefield. The ability to produce and innovate at scale was not just a contributing factor to victory. It was the very foundation upon which victory was built. The strategic lesson was clear. Battles can be lost, ships can be sunk, and territory can be conceded. But a nation with a superior industrial base possesses a resilience that is difficult to defeat. It can absorb blows, replace its losses, and ultimately outlast its adversaries. The United States could lose carriers like the Lexington, Yorktown, and Hornet, and yet, through the Herculean efforts of its shipyards, it could return to the fight with a fleet that was larger and more powerful than before. This was a capacity for recovery that its opponents simply did not possess, and it proved to be the decisive, long-term advantage in the Pacific War. The legacy of this era, however, extends far beyond military strategy. It left an indelible mark on American society. The wartime mobilization brought about profound social changes. The millions of women who entered the industrial workforce as Rosie the Riveters and Wendy the Welders shattered old stereotypes and helped to pave the way for future generations to seek opportunities beyond the domestic sphere. Their competence, dedication, and patriotism were instrumental to the success of the production effort. The war also spurred massive migrations within the United States, as people moved from rural areas to the new industrial centers on the coasts, forever changing the demographic and cultural landscape of the nation. The technological innovations pioneered during this period had a lasting impact. The advances in welding, prefabrication, and large-scale project management that were perfected in the shipyards were later applied to peacetime construction, helping to build the infrastructure of post-war America. The systems-based approach to problem-solving, the idea of breaking down a complex challenge into manageable parallel tasks, became a hallmark of American engineering and management. Most importantly, the story of the shipyards is a deeply human one. It is the story of ordinary people who, when faced with an extraordinary crisis, came together to achieve something remarkable. It is the story of the visionary industrialist who dared to challenge convention, of the engineers who turned audacious ideas into practical blueprints, and of the millions of workers who brought those blueprints to life with their skill and their sweat. They were part of a generation that faced a global threat with courage and determination, a generation that understood the meaning of shared sacrifice for a common cause. In the decades following the war, the great Essex-class carriers, the products of this industrial symphony, continued to serve the nation. They were adapted for the jet age, their decks strengthened and angled to handle new, faster aircraft. They served in the Korean War and the Vietnam War, and they played a role in the space program, recovering astronauts from the sea. Today, several of these historic ships are preserved as museums, floating monuments to the era that created them. They stand as silent reminders of a time when a nation, shaken by a sudden blow, harnessed its creative and productive energies to build an unstoppable tide of steel. Their legacy is not one of conquest, but of resilience. It is a testament to the idea that a free and united people, when faced with a profound challenge, can mobilize their talents and resources to overcome adversity and build a foundation for a more secure future. The echoes of the hammers and welding torches from those bustling wartime shipyards have faded into history, but the lesson they teach, about the incredible potential that lies within collective human endeavor, remains as powerful and relevant as ever.